We now begin the next chapter of Roald Dahl's novel, The Twits. This chapter is called The Frog. Now, as I read the title, I think to myself, what does a frog have to do with Mr. and Mrs. Twit? I know in the last chapter, Mrs. Twit played a bad trick on her husband by putting her glass eye into his mug of beer. Mug is a cup. Okay, and so then I would go through here and I would try to decide what a frog had to do with it. And so I would look at the pictures next to give me some background information before I begin reading. Okay, so I come to this picture, these two pictures together, and I see Mrs. Twit, I see Mrs. Twit looking into her bed sheets, and I see Mrs. Twit apparently asleep while Frog is jumping, and I see water on her pillow. And if I look over here, I can see Mr. Twit looking delighted or happy, happier than I've seen him so far in the book. And if I turn the page, I see a pretty awesome looking frog on top of Mrs. Twit's nose. And she looks zombified. Her eye is really dark around it. And there's obviously water coming off, or she's drooling, maybe. On the last page, I see a very happy frog sleeping. And so I know this is going to have to do with the frog now. Definitely, it's called the frog. And Mr. Twit looking happy, Mrs. Twit looking asleep and different throughout the whole thing. Some water and their bedroom, something to do with their bedroom. Okay, so I'm now going to read you the chapter, and I am still doing the British Cockney accent whenever these characters come up, and hopefully you can tell the difference between me, the narrator, like this, and the two different voices of Mr. and Mrs. Twit, who are our two characters that we've met so far. But I believe in this chapter we meet a frog. Make a prediction whether or not you think the frog is going to be a main character. Okay, ready? Get back to the first page. Excuse me. The frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Okay, so Mr. Twit is trying to play a trick on Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed in the bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet, and she screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed!" "I'll bet it's that giant skilly wiggler I saw on the floor just now," said Mr. Twit. "The what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away. It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me! It's all over my feet!" "It'll bite off your toes," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted, which I guess, this is where we see her in their beds. That's why he looks so happy, and she's trying to figure out what's in bed. And then we see this. She's not sleeping. I guess she fainted. So she didn't get to see it was a frog, but let's see what happens. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her, which means to wake her up. That's where the water came from. The frog crawled up from the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. And she screamed again. "Oh!" "By golly, it is a giant skilly wiggler," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite off your nose." Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. And the frog went to sleep on her pillow. And so, do you think the frog will be a main character? It has a pillow and it's happy, but it doesn't seem to have a voice. Mr. Twit played a mean trick on his wife. We found out where the water came from. It was the water he used. He found some cold water and he dumped it on her face to wake her up or revive her. And he calls it a skillywiggler. A skillywiggler, which is a made-up word or a silly word, and it means apparently something awful with screwdriver teeth. Sounds bad. And then she ran downstairs and slept the night on the sofa. What do you think Mrs. Twit's going to do next? What do you think Mr. Twit's going to do next? Do you think we'll ever hear from the frog again? I cannot stop it using my finger. I keep trying.